Wow, what an incredible worship time. Awesome job, guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good stuff. Well, we're just a week away from Memorial Day, and believe it or not, just 7 weeks away from America's 250th birthday as a nation. So I wanted to take a moment and talk about how each of us can love well within the political climate and division that we find ourselves in the best possible way as followers of Jesus. What does it look like to engage and live out our faith in the political climate that we're in? And even if you're not a follower of Jesus or you're not sure what you believe, I think what we're going to talk about today will be a big help to you as well. And I want to start with 3 words that are very familiar to all of us. In fact, these 3 words have been said many times in many different contexts by people of every race and every political belief. These 3 words we know very, very well, and they're these 3 words: God bless America. And depending on your political or religious views, you may think to yourself, well, God has blessed America. Or you might be thinking, God, we really need you to bless America because of the things happening in our country. Now, for sure, we say the phrase, God bless America, for many different reasons and in various contexts. That phrase, though, was actually made popular by the song that goes by the same title. It was written in 1918 by Irving Berlin, and he wrote it to be a part of a play that he was doing at an army camp, and he ended up deciding at the last minute not to use the song. And so the song sat on the shelf for the next 20 years. And it wasn't until the late 1930s that the song actually began to play on the radio, and obviously it became famous very quickly. And then World War II made it a rally cry for Americans both at home and abroad. You may remember that following the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, the song became popular once again. And if you went to a sporting event after 9/11, stadiums of people would sing both the national anthem, remember this, followed by God Bless America. So for sure, this is a good phrase to say. But if we're really honest about it, most of the time when people are saying this phrase, they're not really thinking about it as a prayer, but more so of a patriotic slogan. It's similar to when college football fans might say, "Go Dogs" or "Roll Tide," right? Most of the time what people are really saying is, I cheer for America and I want good things for America. Or they may see the phrase as more of a lucky rabbit's foot or some sort of good luck charm. In other words, if we say God bless America, things may turn out well for us as a country. But then another phrase came along about 20 or 30 years ago, and you might remember seeing this on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt at some point. But they took the phrase, God bless America, and they turned it around and they said, America bless God. And the idea for many people was that America had been misbehaving, and church attendance was down, and some were removing the 10 Commandments from our courtrooms and schools, and a lot of people felt like that America was turning their back on God. And so what they were really saying was, we need to bless God if we want God to bless America. In other words, we need to turn our attention back to God. We need to be a nation that is for God if we want God to be for us. And while that may have sounded righteous, that's not exactly what the New Testament teaches. In fact, if you look in the Old Testament, that's actually the way that God related to the nation of Israel. In Deuteronomy 28, it talks about the blessings and the curses that would follow Israel and how they behaved and obeyed his commands. And God said, here's what's going to happen. Here's the ways that you're going to be blessed, but if you don't do all that I commanded, right, here's the ways that you will be cursed. But then Jesus came along and he introduced a new covenant, a new arrangement, a new relationship between us and God. He fulfilled the law and he fulfilled those commands on our behalf, and through his death and resurrection, he introduces us to a relationship with God that doesn't hinge on the scorecard that we keep of our good and bad behavior. That's actually removed, and he's blessed us forever through a relationship with him. So the truth is, God is not waiting on us to bless him in order for him to bless us. Now, certainly, before you jump here, there's consequences to our decisions, and there are eventualities that play out on our life when we live our life in ways that honor God, right? It can lead to good things like peace and joy. And if we choose to live in another way, the consequences may be destruction and broken relationships. And because of our daily choices, all of that is still true. But God is saying, listen, I'm not waiting on you to bless me. I've already blessed you. In fact, when you open up the pages of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the accounts of Jesus' life, we discover that Jesus didn't even refer to his followers as Christians, right? That came much, much later. Jesus referred to his followers as disciples, and this term was narrowly defined by him. And if you and I decide to go with this term over the term Christian, there's little doubt how we're to live our life, what we're to believe, what we're to do, and especially how we're to treat other people. So Jesus gathered his followers at the end of his ministry, after he had taught them and told them parables, after he'd preached sermons and performed miracles, after they'd seen him for almost 3 years. He gathered his closest followers in a room where they shared their last Passover. And he told them, okay, this is the last time I have an opportunity to say what's most important for you to remember. And he boiled his whole ministry down to this. Notice what he says, John 13:35. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, my followers, my learners, those who've signed on with me. By this one thing, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. In other words, I want people to say, oh, they must be Christ followers, not by looking at what they believe, not looking at their Sunday morning attendance patterns. I want people to identify you and describe you as a follower of me based on one thing only: the way you treat each other, and ultimately, the way you treat other people. So one day, Jesus was teaching, and some people came to him, and they had a trick question. Now, they were always trying to trick Jesus with questions. And Jesus was really smart when they tried this. Sometimes Jesus wouldn't even answer their questions because he knew the intent of the question. But on this particular occasion, they said in Matthew 22:36, Jesus, of all the laws and all the commandments, which is the greatest commandment? Now, they already had an answer in their mind because the tradition of the elders and the teachers of the law, they knew the answer to this question, but they wanted to know how Jesus would answer it. So, Jesus, what is the greatest, most important law? Now, just for our sake, just remember, there were over 600 different laws from the Old Testament. So, Jesus, out of 600 plus laws, what's the most important law? Now, here's how he answered. Listen to this. He said this in Matthew 22:37. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And before they could raise their hands to ask another question, Jesus said in verse 39, and the second is, and they're thinking, wait, we just asked for one. Of which Jesus said, yeah, but can't give you just one. I got to give you two. Verse 39, and the second is just like it, which means the second is as important as the first one, or the second one goes with the first one, or don't try to pull off the first one without doing the second one, and the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. And before they could raise their hands and ask another question, Jesus said something of such extraordinary significance. Honestly, I don't know how we've missed it. In fact, 25 years later, the Apostle Paul would come back around to this idea and would write specifically about what Jesus said next. And 30 or 40 years later, the Apostle John would come back and write specifically about what Jesus said next. And somewhere along the way, Christ followers, all of us included, have lost sight of what Jesus said next. Listen to this in Matthew 22:40. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. All the law, right? All 613. The 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not do all those things thou shalt not do, thou shalt obey thy parents, right? You know all those things. Then all the things later that were added by the teachers in the New Testament. Do your work as unto the Lord. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Women, submit to your husbands, right? All the teachings of the prophets, all the teachings of the law, all the instructions, all the exhortations that would follow hang on these 2 commandments. So you know what that means? It means that every time we read our Bible, every time we teach a lesson, every time you and I wonder, what should I do in this situation? What does it say about this? What does it say about them? What does it say about that group? What does it say about my wife? What does it say about my husband? What does it say about raising children? What does it say about my ethics? What does it say about my morality? What does it say about sex? What does it say about anything? Every time we read the Bible to find a law, every time we pick up a Bible to find a command, every time we pick up the Bible to find a thou shalt and a thou shalt not, and the Bible is full of those things that instruct us and teach us in the way we're to go. Jesus said to make sure that you and I look at all of that through this incredible filter. In fact, Jesus would say, don't you dare use my law to unnecessarily hurt and disenfranchise people, because the law and the prophets hang or hinge or are filtered through this one command. And here's the filter in Luke 10:27. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All right, so that leads to this big question. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to give yourself permission this morning to think about it. And the question is this: what does love require of me? In other words, if the big idea is people are going to know if I'm a Christ follower by how I treat other people, specifically those inside the faith, and if the whole idea is that every thou shalt and thou shalt not has to be viewed through the filter of treat people the way I want to be treated, then I need to ask this question every single day of my husband, my wife, my children, the people I work for, the people I report to: what does love require of me? Now, come on, this is a game changer. Right, for many of you who grew up in church like I did, this is a big deal, because our tendency is to look at the commands and to forget the intent of the commander. Right, our tendency is to look at the Bible and say, you ought to, you have to, and look what it says right here. And Jesus says, before you get there, you've got to ask this question: what does it look like to love your neighbor as yourself? That's primary. In other words, what does love require of you and me? Now, even if you're not ready to step into this, and even though you're a Christ follower who'd say, you know, Matt, to the best of my ability, I want to take the commands of the Bible seriously, I'm just telling you, you owe it to yourself in every relationship, every conversation, every conflict to at least pause and ask the question: if I were to step into this area that Jesus has invited me into, what would love require of me? So I want to explain how incredibly wise this is. It was so smart for Jesus, by the way, who had just a few followers and had almost no leverage or influence. In a very practical sense, Jesus was a nobody in the Roman Empire. Few cared, most weren't paying attention, which means, right, he could have said anything he wanted to, and yet this was the message God gave to him as he began what we would eventually be called the church. I mean, there's so many things he could have said following this statement in John 13:35, right? By this, all men will know that you're my follower if you just don't swear, or if you refuse to hang out with people who act badly, or if you give to the poor, or are generous with your finances, or 100 other important things. But the brilliance of this statement is actually found in our own personal experience. Let me explain it this way. There are 2 categories of people that have influenced your life profoundly, right? There are 2 categories of people that have made you the father or the wife that you are today. These 2 categories of people have set you up to be successful or not so successful in your personal relationships or in your dating relationships and your search for a partner for life. There are two categories of people that have set you up to be able to relate to people successfully or set you up in such a way that you will always perhaps struggle. And the interesting thing is this: these two categories of people did not influence you deeply because of what they believed. They didn't impact your future and send you into a life successfully or cause you to maybe have to begin to limp through life until you were able to mature and grow past their influence on you. It wasn't what they believed. It wasn't even whether or not they were a Christ follower. It wasn't whether or not they were religious or they even went to church. The two categories of people that have had more to do with who you are today are those who hurt you and those who loved you. And when you find yourself in counseling because you ran up against something you can't get through, a good counselor takes you right there. And do you know what's so incredibly confusing about this? Many of us have been hurt deeply by people who had accurate theology. Many of you have been hurt deeply by people who believed all the right things. Many of you were hurt deeply by people who never missed a Sunday in church. Many of you were hurt deeply by people who knew every chapter and verse for every sin you ever committed. Men with good theology have beaten their wives. Women who taught Sunday school for years have abandoned their children. Some of you were hurt deeply by people who from the outside look like good people, but behind the scenes they took the life out of you and messed up your soul and set you up for an adult life that has been so painful and so difficult that you would say, I feel like I kind of have to limp through life. I'm constantly trying to compensate, not for someone's theology, not for whether or not my parents were Christ followers or believed the Bible, but because I was hurt so deeply. Now, on the other hand, some of you have moved into adulthood with great self-esteem and with a positive outlook on life and with incredible potential because somebody loved you deeply. And you know what? Their theology wasn't all that deep. And they weren't able to find all the chapters and verses in the Bible. And they couldn't tell all the Bible stories. And they may not have been all that regular in church, but they gave you something that set you up for success that goes far beyond all of that. They loved you. It may have been a parent, a coach, a principal, a teacher, somebody who just came alongside you in your small group. Maybe it was somebody that showed up in your 20s and just poured into you. And for the first time in your life, right, you experienced unconditional love. And when you tell your story, you tell a story of hurt and a story of love and a story of the people in your life who just loved you. And it was beyond theology and it was beyond church attendance. You felt something and experienced something with them that spoke directly to your soul, right? You are the husband, the parent, the wife, the friend, the leader because of the impact of these two things you've received. Because the way that you've been treated has more to do with who you are than what you believe. Now listen, this is why what Jesus said is so incredibly profound. And it's why it's so important that those of us who say that we're his followers get this right. This is our greatest leverage and provides our greatest opportunity in our culture. But somewhere along the way, watch, there was a shift from behave to believe. See, when Jesus launched his movement, the church, it was all about how you love, but over time it became all about what you believe. But if we would simply do what Jesus did instead of arguing about what he said, the world would change and the reputation of Christ's followers would change and the influence of the church would change. Listen, believe is easy. It requires almost nothing. Behave requires, in some cases, a brand new worldview. Because here's what Jesus didn't say. A new command I give you, believe correctly. By this, men will know that you're my disciples if you believe correctly. Do you know how much time and energy and how many books, blogs, and sermons have been written and spoken by people who say they follow Jesus, arguing with each other about exactly what Jesus meant by what Jesus said? Come on. But in the beginning, it wasn't that way. It was simple. It was love one another. It was the constantly going back to the question, what does love require of me? It's brilliant. because Jesus repeatedly in the Bible knew the heart of people, right? Every time Jesus encountered someone, it was always based on their story. Now, we've all had this experience. Come on. You don't like someone, they're irritating. Don't look around right now. Their personality wears on you, and then you hear their story, and your heart changes, doesn't it? I mean, every single time Jesus interacted with an individual, he did so with their story in mind. And he answered the question in every conversation, what does love require of me? But when you read the New Testament, I'm just telling you, Jesus was so inconsistent about this. Do you know why Jesus at times was so angry with one group and then so compassionate with another group? Remember one time in the Bible, he told this rich guy, you're going to have to sell everything to get this right, and then you can follow me. And then to another rich guy, he said, you're close. And we're like, wait. Why didn't you tell him to sell everything? Because they're two different people with two different stories and different hearts. So think about what would happen if you and I would look at people's story and ask the question, in light of who I am because of Christ, and who they are, and in consideration of what I've been through and what they've been through, what does love require of me? Can you imagine what would happen in our families? Can you imagine what would happen in our community if all of us who are Christ followers would put down all of our objections and theological differences and decide, you know what? For a week, for a month, for a year, I'm simply going to ask the question, what does love require of me? Because if you would like to see people change, if you'd like to have influence on their future, you basically have two options. You can hurt them deeply or you can love them profoundly. Because it's not just what you believe, it's how you treat them. So Jesus said, by this, all men will know that you're my followers, based on how you treat one another. So I want to give you 3 key statements that takes what does love require of me to the next level. Because at Springbrook, this is central to who we are, because every time we open the Bible and we look at what Jesus says and what the Apostle Paul teaches, and every time we look at the Old Testament stories, we're asking this question, how do we live this out? So I want to take it out of the theoretical when we ask, what does love require of me? And I want to give you 3 statements that force us to wrestle with the question of how do we get better at not simply believing right things, that's important, but treating people in a way that heals their hurt and loves them towards our Savior, Jesus Christ, who loved them so much that he died for them. What does love require of you and me? First, love requires of you that you don't do anything that hurts you. You know why? Because your Heavenly Father loves you and you can't do anything to you that doesn't hurt him. And if you're a parent, you get this. I have adult sons. My sons can't hurt themselves without it hurting me. Why? Because I love them. Do you know what love requires of you? Love requires of you that you never make a moral or ethical decision, a relational or professional decision that hurts you, because when you hurt you, you hurt the one that loves you the most. And I know what we say, well, that's just about me. It's nobody else's business. No, it's not just between you and you, because you're loved. It's not just your life. It's not just your world. It's not just your relationship. It's not just your profession. It's not just your reputation. Your Heavenly Father loves you, and love requires that you respond to his love by taking care of you because he loves you. All right, what does love require of you and me? Second, love requires that you don't do anything to hurt someone else. Now, let me clear this up. I'm not talking about serving in the military or serving in law enforcement. For all the junk going around in our culture, the New Testament is so clear about that. I'm talking about your interpersonal relationships. I'm talking about that you must decide, regardless of how I understand or see the world, regardless of how I view my Christianity, regardless of my personal maturity, I'm not going to do or say anything that hurts another person. And here's why. Because every person you are ever eyeball to eyeball with is someone that your Heavenly Father has sent his Son to die for, right? Everyone you ever see, everyone you ever interact with is someone that God loves as much as he loves you and me. Everyone you ever speak to, even your worst enemies, the people you just can't stand and the ones that can't stand you, the people that have hurt you the most are people for whom Christ died. And I realize this is tricky because this involves both confrontation and confession. And confrontation and confession hurt, but sometimes loving the way you need to love is using a scalpel relationally, but listen, it's never like using a machete, right? Do you know what love requires of you? That you just decide that once and for all, the filter through which my words will come and through which my actions will come, I'm not going to do anything to hurt, betray, deceive, tempt, abuse, or hurt another person. What does love require of you and me? Third, that you not be mastered by anything. You know why? Because whenever you're mastered by something, it will keep you from loving someone. Right? No one should have to compete with your alcohol. No one should have to compete with your prescription drug addiction. No one should have to compete with your anger. No one should have to compete with your temper. No one should have to compete with anything that masters you. Refuse to be mastered by anything, because listen, Christ followers, God is our master. Do you know what love requires of you? Love requires of you that you get rid of anything in your life that competes with his lordship, of him being king and ruler in your life, anything, because you cannot love as long as you're mastered. So again, number one, don't do anything that hurts you. Number two, don't do anything to hurt someone else. And number three, be mastered by nothing. Now that's very easy, isn't it? Thank you for being here today. But here's the problem. As I went through that list, do you know what some of you have just done? Be honest. Some of you have just thought of other people. I'm sure glad my husband's in the room today. I hope he was listening. As soon as I get in the car, we're calling our children. And we're going to tell them they need to listen to this message twice. But be honest, isn't that the perspective that has caused you to be hurt the most by people who claim to be Christians? So what if we just decide that we'll let God take care of them, and we decide, I'm not going to hurt me, right? And whatever it takes to get into a place where I'm not hurting me any longer, I'm going to go there. I'm going to get counseling. I'm going to confess. I'm breaking these habits. I'm not going to do anything to hurt anyone else any longer. And where I have, I'm going to confess. It's going to be painful, but it's going to lead to healing. And I'm going to confront some people because I have not loved them well, and I've let them get by with things, and I haven't loved, and it's painful and it's challenging, but I'm not going to continue to hurt them by remaining silent, and I'm not going to be mastered by anything. So here's what I think Jesus was getting at, and here's what we've lost sight of. That when his followers and when the church leverages anything else other than love, we ultimately lose our influence. And you know this, because we've lost influence in our culture. And it's not because of politics. It's not because of Democrats. It's not because of Republicans. It's not because of religious denominations. It's not because of any of that. See, many decades ago, and I lived through this, and some of you have, when the church got into power, and when the church had control, and when the church had the money, and when the church had the influence, and when the church had the ability to persuade politics, and when the church had the ability to influence legislation, you know what we did? We went to the voting booth and we voted. And we began to leverage something else. And as a result, we began to lose our influence. You see, it wasn't always that way. Once upon a time, there was a handful of Christ followers, and all they had was love one another. Right? They didn't even have the New Testament. They didn't even have the writings of Paul. These were groups of people who had no books, no literature, no publishing houses, no Christian radio, no Christian TV. They didn't even have the Hallmark Channel. I mean, they had nothing. But time after time, they had this one simple idea. What if we love one another? Listen, we must never lose sight of the intent of the commander and get hung up on the commands. I'm not saying ignore them, but don't get hung up on them. What if we love one another is the grid through which we interpret all of the Old Testament and all of the writings of the Apostle Paul and all the others who wrote in the New Testament. And we know from history that's how Christianity grew. That's how culture was influenced. That's how paganism was turned upside down. That's why an entire belief system based on Greek gods that seems imaginary and mythical to us, but was real to people in that world, that's how it went away. Not because of the leverage of power, influence, and status and the wealth of the church, but because they loved one another. Right? Nobody felt coerced because there was no way to coerce anyone. They were drawn with the message of, come and see, right? No one's going to force you. No one's going to push you away. Just come and see and watch us love. Now think about this. We know that people feel guilty when the truth of Christ and the way they were living was contrasted. But you know what? In the first century, they didn't feel condemned. They felt guilty because they looked at marriages and at relationships that were so profoundly different, and they discovered a work ethic that was so incredibly different, and they saw a depth of relationship and a courageous generosity that was so different, and the pagans in the first century felt guilty because they knew they weren't living as those people did, but somehow, listen, they didn't feel condemned. And if that ever characterizes my life, in your life, and if it ever characterizes who we are as Springbrook Community Church, there will be influence like we can't even imagine. But I'm just telling you, the moment we abandon love, we lose influence. You cannot preach people into loving Jesus. You cannot preach people into loving each other. You cannot preach people out of habits. You can't preach people out of addictions. You can't legislate them out of habits. You can't legislate them out of addictions. You can't force a husband to love his wife like Christ loved the church. You can't discipline children enough to understand that God set up authority. None of that happens through preaching or legislation or rule keeping or the church being a political voting group in America. It only happens in our culture when what is seen by us as Christ followers is how we love. And it's so attractive that it's almost irresistible. So let's be the church that isn't satisfied until we ask the question in every interaction we have, what does love require of me? And just maybe it could be said of us, as it was the first century Christ followers, that by this everyone will know that we're his disciples because we love one another and because we love the people in our community. Because how we behave is a clear reflection of what we say we believe. Listen to this song.